I never thought I'd live to see the day when my own son told me I wasn't wanted at the happiest moment of his life. His wedding, something I had imagined since he was a little boy running through the backyard, was meant to be a celebration of family. Instead, he said my presence would make things uncomfortable. I can still hear the coldness in his voice, as though I were nothing more than a burden to be hidden away. It wasn't anger that crushed me, but the quiet certainty that I no longer had a place in his world. I didn't argue, I didn't beg, but I did write a letter, one I asked my lawyer to deliver on the day itself, and when it was read aloud, the silence in that room told me everything I needed to know. I never thought a phone call could break a man's heart in 30 seconds, but on that Tuesday evening in March, as I stood in my kitchen stirring a pot of soup that would go cold and untouched, my son Daniel's voice came through the receiver like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Dad, I need to tell you something about the wedding." I set down the wooden spoon, my hand already trembling, though I didn't yet know why. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in as I waited for words that would change everything. "Sarah and we've decided to keep it small, very intimate, just immediate family." "I'm immediate family," I wanted to say, but something in his tone, rehearsed, distant, final, kept me silent. "So I won't be there?" The words fell out of me like stones. "It's nothing personal, Dad. It's just, it would be better this way." Better. That word would echo in my head for months. Better for whom? Better than what? Better than having your father witness the most important day of your life? I gripped the edge of the kitchen table, my knuckles white against the worn wood. Across from me, hanging on the refrigerator beneath a magnet shaped like a baseball glove, was a photograph of Daniel at 8 years old in his Little League uniform, gap-toothed smile, dirt on his cheek, holding up a trophy we'd celebrated with ice cream afterward. That boy would have wanted his dad at his wedding. This man on the phone, I didn't recognize his voice. "Daniel," I said, and my voice sounded far away, even to me. "Are you sure about this?" "Yes, Dad, I'm sure." The line went quiet, except for the sound of my own breathing. In that silence, I heard the death of something I couldn't name. "I have to go," he said. "Sarah's calling me." Sarah. The woman I'd met exactly 3 times in the 2 years they'd been together. The woman who would become my daughter-in-law without me there to witness it. The woman who perhaps had decided that fathers like me didn't belong in lives like theirs. After he hung up, I stood there holding the phone until the dial tone became unbearable. I set it down and looked around my kitchen, really looked at it. The ceramic mug he'd made me in middle school art class sat on the counter, still my favorite for morning coffee. His high school graduation photo smiled at me from the windowsill. 27 years of fatherhood surrounded me in this room, and none of it seemed to matter anymore. Before I continue, let me ask you something. If you've ever felt forgotten by someone you love, if you've ever been pushed aside by the very person you raised and cherished, please hit that like button, subscribe if these stories matter to you, and leave a comment. Tell me about the moments that broke your heart. Sometimes sharing our pain is the only way to heal it. I pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, my legs suddenly weak. The soup continued bubbling on the stove, filling the air with the smell of vegetables and herbs that now made my stomach turn. I should eat something, I told myself. I should do something normal, something that proved this was just another evening in just another life. But I couldn't move. I couldn't stop staring at that photograph of Daniel in his baseball uniform. Couldn't stop remembering the weight of his small hand in mine as we walked to the car after every game. Win or lose, he'd always wanted to stop for ice cream. Always wanted to tell me about every play, every moment, every feeling that had crossed his mind during those 2 hours on the field. "Did you see me hit that ball, Dad? Did you see how far it went?" I had seen. I had seen everything. Every game, every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every midnight fever and scraped knee and broken heart over playground drama. I had been there. And now I wouldn't be there for the most important day of his adult life. My chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped wire around my ribs and was slowly twisting it tighter. This wasn't stress. This wasn't disappointment. This was something deeper, something that reached into the very core of what it meant to be a father. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe Sarah's family was large and they truly needed to keep numbers down. Maybe there had been some misunderstanding, some miscommunication that could be fixed with a simple conversation. Maybe Daniel was under pressure. Maybe he didn't really mean it. Maybe tomorrow he'd call back laughing about how silly this whole thing had been. But even as I grasped for these explanations, I knew they were lies I was telling myself. There had been something final in his voice, something that spoke of a decision made long ago and rehearsed until it could be delivered without emotion. The kitchen grew darker as the sun set outside my window. I didn't turn on the lights. Somehow the darkness felt appropriate, like a blanket that matched the hollow feeling spreading through my chest. I thought about calling him back. My finger even hovered over his contact information, saved in my phone as Annie, because that's what I'd called him until he turned 18 and decided Daniel sounded more professional. But what would I say? Would I beg? Would I demand an explanation? Would I remind him of every sacrifice I'd made, every bedtime story I'd read, every little league practice I'd attended despite being exhausted from 12-hour workdays? No, I couldn't do that. A man doesn't beg his own son for the right to love him. The soup burned while I sat there in the dark. The smell of scorched vegetables filled the air, acrid and bitter, but I didn't move to turn off the stove. Let it burn, I thought. Let something else in this house be ruined tonight. Finally, when the smoke detector began its shrill warning, I stood up and turned off the burner. I opened the windows to clear the air, then scraped the ruined meal into the garbage disposal. Another evening, another meal, another moment of my life disposed of as easily as burnt soup. I poured myself a glass of water and tried to think clearly. There had to be a reason. Sons don't simply decide their fathers are unwelcome at their weddings without cause. Had I said something, done something, failed to do something? I replayed our last conversation before tonight, searching for clues. It had been 2 weeks ago, a brief phone call where I'd asked about wedding plans. He'd been vague, mentioning venues and guest lists without giving details. When I'd offered to help with costs, the father of the groom traditionally pays for certain things, I'd reminded him gently. He'd said they had it handled. We want to do this ourselves, Dad. It's important to us to be independent. Independent. Another word that would haunt me now. Independent of family. Independent of history, independent of the man who had changed his diapers and taught him to ride a bike and stayed up with him through pneumonia when he was 6 years old. I walked through my house that night like a ghost, touching objects that suddenly felt like museum pieces from a life that no longer existed. His room, which I'd kept exactly as he'd left it when he moved out for college 8 years ago. His bookshelf, still filled with Harry Potter novels and sports biographies. His desk, where he'd done homework while I sat nearby, available for questions he rarely asked, but somehow needing to be present anyway. In the living room, I stopped in front of the mantelpiece where photographs marked the milestones of his life. First day of school, missing front teeth and oversized backpack. Middle school graduation, all arms and legs and awkward pride. High school prom, handsome in his rented tuxedo, Sarah Miller on his arm. Not the Sarah he was marrying now, but another girl who had seemed important once upon a time. College graduation, my own chest swelling with pride as I watched him accept his diploma. There should have been another photograph up there soon. Wedding pictures, my son in his wedding tuxedo, his bride in white, and somewhere in the background, if I was lucky, a proud father trying not to cry. But there would be no such photograph in my house. I wouldn't even know what his bride looked like on their wedding day unless someone else took pity on me and shared pictures later. I picked up the prom photograph and studied his face. 17 years old, confident, happy, still willing to include his old man in the important moments. When had that changed? When had I become someone to be excluded rather than included? The house felt too quiet, too empty, too full of memories that suddenly seemed like evidence of failure rather than success. I had raised a boy who no longer wanted me in his life. Somewhere along the way, despite all my efforts, all my love, all my presence, I had become expendable. I set the photograph back on the mantel and walked to my bedroom. As I changed into pajamas, I caught sight of myself in the mirror above my dresser. 58 years old, graying hair, lines around my eyes that spoke of decades of laughter and worry and love. Did I look like a stranger to my own son? Had I become someone he was embarrassed to claim as family? I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over. Each time I heard something new in his voice, distance, discomfort, relief maybe, that he'd finally gotten the words out. It would be better this way. Better for everyone except the man who had loved him since before he drew his first breath. Better for everyone except the father, who still kept his childhood artwork on the refrigerator, and still worried when storms passed through his city, and still set aside money each month in case he ever needed help. Sleep didn't come until nearly dawn, and when it did, it brought dreams of empty churches and missing faces, and the echo of a boy's voice calling, "Did you see me, Dad? Did you see?" I had seen everything, but apparently that was no longer enough. The morning after Daniel's call, I woke up feeling like I'd been hollowed out from the inside. My coffee tasted like ash, my reflection in the bathroom mirror looked like a stranger, and the house seemed to echo with a silence that felt permanent. I found myself walking through the rooms like a detective at a crime scene, searching for clues to understand what had gone wrong. Every corner held evidence of the father I thought I'd been, but maybe I'd been wrong about everything. In the hallway, I stopped in front of Daniel's high school graduation photo. Cap and gown, that proud smile, my arm around his shoulders as we posed after the ceremony. I remembered that day so clearly, how I'd bragged to everyone who would listen about his acceptance to college, how I'd promised him I'd help however I could, how he'd hugged me and said, "Thanks for everything, Dad." What had happened between that hug and yesterday's phone call? I wanned, dared into the dining room and stared at his empty chair. For 18 years, he'd sat there for breakfast before school, homework scattered across the table. Backpack hanging on the chair's arm. I used to lecture him about keeping his elbows off the table, about chewing with his mouth closed, about sitting up straight. Had I been too critical, too demanding? My ex-wife Linda used to say I expected too much from him. "He's just a boy," she'd tell me when I'd insist he finish his vegetables or redo sloppy homework. "Let him be a kid." But I hadn't wanted him to be just any kid. I'd wanted him to be better than I was, to have more opportunities, to never know the kind of struggle I'd known growing up. Maybe that pressure had pushed him away. I pulled out his chair and sat down, running my hands along the scratched wood of the table. Here, he'd built Lego castles while I made dinner. Here, he'd practiced spelling words while I checked his math homework. Here, we'd talked about girls and grades and dreams for the future. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I'd asked him once when he was maybe 10 years old. "I want to be like you, Dad," he'd said without looking up from his cereal bowl. The memory hit me like a physical blow. When had that changed? When had being like me become something to avoid rather than aspire to? I stood up abruptly and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where we'd thrown countless baseballs, where I'd taught him to mow the lawn, where we'd built a treehouse that still stood in the old oak, weathered but sturdy. All those hours together, all those conversations, all those moments when I thought I was building something lasting with my son. Maybe I'd been building a prison instead. Maybe every lesson, every expectation, every "when I was your age" story had felt like chains to him. Maybe he'd been planning his escape for years. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through our text messages from the past few months. They were brief, functional. "How's work?" "Fine." "Everything at once?" "Okay." "Yep." "Call me when you get a chance." No response. When had our conversations become so stilted? When had he stopped calling just to talk, stopped asking for advice, stopped sharing the details of his life? The truth was, I wasn't sure I knew Sarah at all. I'd met her 3 times in 2 years, and each encounter had felt like a job interview where I was failing to impress. She was polite, professional, distant. She asked about my work, complimented my house, thanked me for dinner, but I never felt like she saw me as anything more than an obligation. "Sarah seems nice," I'd told Daniel after their first visit. "She is," he'd replied, but he hadn't elaborated. He used to tell me everything about the girls he dated, what they talked about, what they had in common, what he liked about them. With Sarah, he kept his cards close to his chest. Maybe she didn't like me. Maybe she'd decided I was too old-fashioned, too blue-collar, too much of a reminder of a world she wanted to leave behind. Maybe she'd convinced Daniel that fathers like me didn't belong in lives like theirs. Or maybe this wasn't about her at all. Maybe this was about me, about failures I couldn't see, but my son couldn't ignore. I walked to my bedroom and opened the closet where I kept a box of Daniel's childhood artwork and school projects. Finger paintings from kindergarten, a clay ashtray he'd made in 3rd grade even though I didn't smoke, A Father's Day card from when he was 12 that read, "You're the best dad in the world," in his careful handwriting. Had I been the best dad in the world? Or had I just thought I was while missing all the ways I was actually failing him? I remembered the arguments we'd had when he was in high school. Nothing major, curfew violations, grades that could have been better, the time he'd dented my car and tried to hide it from me. I'd handled those situations the way my father had handled them with me, firmly, with clear consequences, with lectures about responsibility and respect. But maybe Daniel had needed something different. Maybe he'd needed understanding instead of lectures, flexibility instead of rules, acceptance instead of constant pushing to be better. I pulled out a school report from his sophomore year. "Daniel is a bright student with great potential," his English teacher had written. "However, he seems to struggle with confidence and often appears anxious about meeting expectations. Anxious about meeting expectations. My expectations." I set the report aside and picked up a photograph from his 10th birthday party. He was grinning at the camera, chocolate cake smeared across his cheek, surrounded by friends in our backyard. I was standing behind him, my hands on his shoulders, smiling just as widely. He'd wanted a big party that year, had planned it for weeks, made lists of games and decorations and snacks. I'd been hesitant. 10 seemed young for such an elaborate celebration, but Linda had convinced me to let him have what he wanted. The party had been perfect, kids everywhere, laughter echoing through the house, Daniel glowing with happiness as he opened presents and played games and felt celebrated by everyone who mattered to him. Why hadn't I remembered that more often? Why had I focused so much on the lessons and the rules and the preparation for adulthood that I'd forgotten to celebrate the child he was? My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a split second my heart leaped with hope. Maybe Daniel had reconsidered. Maybe he'd realized his mistake. Maybe, but it was just a spam message about car insurance. I sat on the edge of my bed and typed out a message to Daniel. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. I want you to know that I love you and I respect your decision. If there's anything I've done to hurt you, I'm sorry. I just want you to be happy." I read it 3 times, deleted it, rewrote it, deleted it again. How do you apologize for crimes you don't understand? How do I? I'll fix a relationship when you don't know what broke it. Finally, I typed something simple. "I love you, son. I hope you have a beautiful wedding." I hit send before I could change my mind. His response came 2 hours later, just 2 words that felt like a door slamming shut. "Please don't." I stared at those words until they blurred through my tears. Please don't love you. Please don't hope for your happiness. Please don't exist in your life. The message was clear enough. Whatever I'd done, whatever I'd failed to do, whatever I represented in his life now, he wanted none of it. Not my love, not my regret, not my presence, not even my well wishes from a distance. I was being erased. That evening, I sat in my recliner with a glass of whiskey I barely touched, staring at the wall where Daniel's graduation photo hung. The house felt like a museum dedicated to a relationship that no longer existed, filled with artifacts from a love that apparently hadn't been enough. I thought about calling Linda, my ex-wife, to ask if she knew what had gone wrong. We'd divorced when Daniel was 15, but we'd managed to stay civil for his sake. She might have insights I was missing, might know things he'd told her, but not me. But pride stopped me from picking up the phone. If she knew why he'd excluded me from his wedding, then she was part of the problem. And if she didn't know, then I'd just be spreading my humiliation to another person who'd once loved me, but had ultimately decided I wasn't worth keeping. The whiskey sat untouched as darkness fell outside my windows. Somewhere across town, my son was planning the most important day of his life, and I was just another item crossed off his list. Not the guest list, not the vendor list, not even the worry list, just crossed off, like a mistake that needed correcting. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time he'd said, "I love you" to me. It had been months, maybe longer. When had that stopped? When had we moved from "love you, Dad" at the end of phone calls to just "talk to you later" to just "bye"? When had I become someone my own son felt he needed to protect his happiness from? 3 days passed after Daniel's 2-word text message. 3 days of walking through my house like a prisoner in my own life, picking up objects that reminded me of better times, setting them down again with the growing certainty that those times were never coming back. On Saturday morning, I made a decision that felt both desperate and necessary. I would drive to his house and speak to him face to face. Phone calls could be ended, text messages could be ignored, but surely he couldn't close the door on his own father standing on his doorstep. I showered and shaved with more care than I'd taken all week, choosing my clothes like I was dressing for an interview. Navy slacks, the blue button-down shirt Daniel had given me for Father's Day 2 years ago, the watch he'd bought me for my 50th birthday. If I was going to plead my case, I wanted to look like the father he'd once been proud to claim. The drive to his house took 25 minutes through neighborhoods that had grown more expensive and pristine with each mile. Daniel lived in a development where every lawn was perfect, every mailbox matched, every house looked like it had been designed by the same architect with the same dream of suburban success. His house was a colonial with white shutters and a front porch that held 2 matching wicker chairs. I'd helped him pick out those chairs, had driven him to 3 different furniture stores until he found exactly what he wanted. "Sarah loves the way they look," he'd said, and I'd been happy to spend my Saturday helping him make her happy. Now I sat in my car across the street, staring at those chairs and wondering if Sarah was the one who'd decided I didn't fit into this picture-perfect life they were building. I'd written a letter the night before, nothing desperate or demanding, just a father trying to reach his son with words I couldn't seem to say out loud. It was folded in my shirt pocket, the paper soft from handling, the words I'd rehearsed a dozen times, still feeling inadequate. Taking a deep breath, I got out of the car and walked across the street. My legs felt unsteady, like I was walking into a job interview that would determine the rest of my life, which, in a way, I was. The doorbell made a cheerful 2-note chime that seemed to mock the heaviness in my chest. I heard footsteps inside, voices, the sound of a television being turned down. My heart hammered against my ribs as I waited, but the door didn't open. I could see shadows moving behind the frosted glass panel, could hear whispered conversation, could sense the life continuing on the other side of this barrier. I rang the bell again, then knocked gently. "Daniel?" I called softly. "It's Dad. I just want to talk for a minute." The shadows stopped moving. The whispered voices fell silent. Even the television seemed to hold its breath. I waited there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my hand raised to knock again, my throat tight with words I needed to say. Inside I could hear soft laughter, the clink of dishes, the sound of a life moving forward without any need for me. "I know you're in there," I said, not loudly, not angrily, just stating a fact that we both knew was true. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I need to understand." But the door remained closed, solid and final as a tombstone. A neighbor was working in her garden across the street, glancing over at me with the kind of polite curiosity that would turn into neighborhood gossip by evening. I imagined the story she'd tell. The older man standing at the young couple's door, being ignored, looking lost and smaller with each passing minute. The letter in my pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric. I pulled it out, smoothed the creases, and slipped it through the mail slot beside the door. At least my words would make it inside, even if I couldn't. "There's a letter," I said to the closed door. "Just read it, please. That's all I'm asking." I heard the soft whisper of paper hitting the floor inside, then footsteps moving away from the door, moving away from me. Walking back to my car, I felt like every step was taking me further from the son I'd raised, and deeper into a loneliness I'd never experienced before. This wasn't the grief of death, which at least came with sympathy and understanding. This was the grief of being rejected by someone who was supposed to love you, of being found unworthy by the person you'd spent 27 years trying to worthy for. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the house where my son lived his life without me. The white shutters, the perfect lawn, the 2 wicker chairs where he and Sarah probably sat in the evenings, planning their future, talking about their dreams, making decisions about their wedding that would happen without me. The drive home passed in a blur of stop signs and traffic lights and other people living their normal Saturday lives. At a red light, I watched a father teaching his young daughter to ride a bike in a park. She wobbled and laughed and called out, "Watch me, Daddy! Are you watching?" And he was watching, beaming with pride, ready to catch her if she fell. I remember teaching Daniel to ride his bike in that same park. He'd been so determined, so frustrated when he couldn't get his balance, so thrilled when he finally rode a whole lap around the parking lot without falling. "Did you see me, Dad?" he'd shouted, his face glowing with achievement. "I did it!" I had seen him. I'd seen everything, every milestone, every triumph, every moment of growth and discovery. I'd been there for scraped knees and bad dreams, for homework struggles and friend drama, for every chapter of his childhood that had led to this man who no longer wanted me in his story. At home, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat in my kitchen, staring at the spot on the refrigerator where his Little League photo still hung. The boy in that picture would never have closed a door on his father. That boy had run to me with scraped knees and big dreams, had asked me to check for monsters under his bed, had fallen asleep in my arms during late-night fevers. What had I done to lose that boy? When had I stopped being his hero and become his burden? The phone rang around 8 o'clock that evening. For a wild moment, I thought it might be Daniel, that maybe my visit had accomplished something, that maybe my letter had reached him somehow. But it was Linda, my ex-wife, and her voice was tight with something I couldn't identify. "Tom," she said without preamble, "Daniel called me. He said you went to his house today." "I did," I said, not apologizing, not explaining. "He asked me to talk to you, to ask you to give him some space." Space. Another word that would join better and independent in the collection of things people said when they meant without you. "Did he tell you why?" I asked. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. "He said it's complicated, that there are things, family dynamics that are hard to explain." Family dynamics. As if our family was some complex equation instead of a father who loved his son and had apparently failed him in ways I still couldn't understand. "Linda," I said quietly, "I need to know what I did wrong." Another pause. "Maybe it's not about what you did wrong. Maybe it's just, maybe he needs to build his own life now. Maybe having parents too involved makes it harder for him to feel like an adult." Too involved. For 27 years, I'd thought involvement was what good fathers did. I'd thought showing up, caring, being present was what love looked like. Now, I was learning that love could be seen as interference, that caring could be viewed as controlling, that presence could feel like pressure. "So I'm supposed to just disappear?" I asked. "Not disappear," she said, but her tone suggested that's exactly what she meant. "Just step back. Let him come to you when he's ready." When he's ready? What if he's never ready? What if this stepping back becomes a permanent exile? What if the space he needs becomes an ocean I can never cross? After Linda hung up, I sat alone in my kitchen as darkness settled around me like a blanket. My letter was inside Daniel's house now, my words scattered on his floor like fallen leaves. Either he would read them and understand, or he would throw them away like everything else from his childhood that no longer fit his adult life. I thought about the man I'd tried to be as a father, present but not smothering, supportive but not enabling, loving but not weak. I'd wanted to give him roots and wings, stability and freedom, the security of knowing he was loved and the confidence to love others. Instead, I'd apparently given him something he needed to escape from. The whiskey burned going down, but it didn't warm the cold place in my chest where my son's love used to live. I sat there until the ice melted and the glass grew warm in my hands, until the kitchen clock chimed midnight and another day ended without progress, without understanding, without hope. Outside my window, the world slept peacefully. Fathers and sons who hadn't lost each other, families who still sat around dinner tables together, love that hadn't somehow turned into something too complicated to explain. I envied them all. The weeks that followed my visit to Daniel's house settled into a routine of emptiness that I wore like an ill-fitting coat. Every morning, I woke up hoping the phone would ring with his voice. Every evening, I went to bed with the silence still echoing in my ears. I found myself talking aloud more often, conversations with memories that felt more real than the quiet house around me. Making coffee in the morning, I'd catch myself saying, "Daniel always liked his coffee black, just like his old man." Watching the evening news, I'd comment to the empty living room, "Your boy would have something to say about this story." It was during one of these one-sided conversations that I realized I was starting to sound like my own father in his final years, talking to pictures on the mantel, carrying on discussions with people who weren't there. The thought should have alarmed me, but instead it felt like a natural progression into a life where the people who mattered most had become echoes. One evening I stood in front of the bathroom mirror after brushing my teeth, really studying my reflection for the first time in months. 58 years old, gray, creeping through what was left of my brown hair, lines around my eyes that spoke of decades of worry and laughter and love. When Daniel looked at me now, if he looked at me at all, did he see an old man? A relic from a past he was eager to bury? I tried to see myself through his eyes. The father who had coached his little league team, but maybe pushed too hard for victories. The man who had worked double shifts to pay for his college, but maybe made him feel guilty for the sacrifice. The parent who had worried about his choices, but maybe made him feel like nothing he did was ever quite good enough. Standing there in my boxer shorts and old t-shirt, I looked like exactly what I was. An aging man whose relevance had expired, whose opinions no longer mattered, whose love had somehow become an inconvenience. But beneath the self-doubt, something else was stirring. Not just sadness now, but anger. The kind of quiet fury that builds slowly, like water behind a dam, until it becomes impossible to ignore. I was angry at Daniel for his coldness, for the way he'd reduced 27 years of fatherhood to a two-word text message. I was angry at Sarah for whatever role she'd played in this rejection, for looking at me like I was something that needed to be managed rather than welcomed. I was angry at Linda for her careful neutrality, for treating this like a diplomatic problem instead of a family falling apart. But mostly, I was angry at myself for all the ways I'd apparently failed without knowing it. The anger felt better than the sadness, more productive than the endless questions. Anger had direction, had energy, had the possibility of action. Sadness just sat there like a stone in my chest, growing heavier with each passing day. I started making lists in my head of all the things I'd done right as a father. The midnight trips to the emergency room when he had croup as a toddler. The countless hours spent helping with homework, even subjects I barely understood myself. The way I'd rearranged my work schedule to attend every school play, every game, every graduation ceremony that mattered to him. I remembered the time he'd been bullied in middle school, coming home with a black eye and a story about kids who'd called him names and pushed him around. I'd wanted to march into that school and demand justice, but instead I'd sat with him at the kitchen table and taught him how to stand up for himself without becoming a bully in return. The strongest men know when to fight and when to walk away, I'd told him, but you never let anyone make you feel small. He'd listened, nodding seriously, trusting me to guide him through one of childhood's cruelest lessons. By the end of the week, the bullying had stopped. Daniel had found his confidence, his strength, his sense of self-worth. Where was that boy now? Where was the son who had trusted me to help him navigate the world? I thought about the conversation we'd had when he was 16 and had gotten his first serious girlfriend, Jennifer Walsh, a sweet girl with freckles and a laugh that filled our house whenever she came over. He'd been nervous about asking her to the winter formal, convinced she'd say no, certain he wasn't good enough for someone like her. Son, I'd said, if she can't see what a good man you're becoming, then she's not worth your worry. But my guess is she already knows exactly who you are, and she's waiting for you to figure it out too. He'd asked her the next day. She'd said yes. They'd dated for 2 years, through the rest of high school, and even though they'd broken up when college took them in different directions, it had been an amicable parting. She still sent him Christmas cards, still asked about him when she ran into me at the grocery store. How's Daniel doing? She'd asked just last month, her face lighting up with genuine affection. I heard he's getting married soon. He is, I'd said, smiling with what I thought was pride. I'm sure it'll be a beautiful wedding. I hadn't known then that I wouldn't be there to see it. I hadn't known that my son had already decided his father didn't belong in his new life. These memories swirled through my mind as I stood in front of the mirror, trying to reconcile the father I remembered being with the man my son apparently saw now. Had every piece of advice felt like criticism? Had every expression of pride felt like pressure? Had every "I love you" felt like a burden? I thought about Sarah again, trying to understand what kind of woman would ask her fiancé to exclude his father from their wedding. Or maybe she hadn't asked at all. Maybe Daniel had made this decision on his own, deciding that his old-fashioned blue-collar father would embarrass him in front of her professional friends and successful family. The thought stung because it felt possible, even probable. Sarah worked in marketing for some tech company, lived in a world of conference calls and client presentations and networking events. Her parents were both professors, intellectuals who probably discussed philosophy over dinner and spent their vacations touring museums in Europe. What would they think of a man who'd spent 30 years installing kitchen cabinets, whose idea of culture was taking his son to baseball games, whose college education had been interrupted by military service and never resumed? I could imagine their polite smiles, their careful questions about my work, their subtle assessment that I didn't quite fit their definition of appropriate family. Maybe Daniel was protecting me from that judgment, or maybe he was protecting himself from the embarrassment of claiming me as his father in front of people whose respect he valued more than mine. Either way, the result was the same. I was being erased from the most important day of his life. The mirror reflected back a man who looked tired, older than his years, worn down by rejection he still didn't fully understand. But it also showed someone who was still standing, still breathing, still capable of fighting for what mattered. I had raised a good man, even if he no longer wanted to acknowledge where that goodness had come from. I had been present for every moment that had shaped him, had loved him through every phase of his growth, had sacrificed my own comfort countless times to give him opportunities I'd never had. That man in the mirror, that father who had given everything he had, deserved better than to be dismissed with a 2-word text message. He deserved better than to be treated like a mistake that needed correcting. The anger was building now, not the destructive kind that leads to poor decisions, but the righteous kind that leads to action. I was done being sad. I was done making excuses for my son's cruelty. I was done accepting that somehow, despite all evidence to the contrary, I had been such a terrible father that I deserved to be thrown away like garbage. If Daniel wanted to erase me from his life, fine, but he was going to have to look me in the eye while he did. He was going to have to hear what his rejection cost, what his silence meant, what his coldness did to the man who had loved him since before he drew his first breath. I was done being quiet. I was done stepping back. I was done giving him the space he claimed to need. If my son wanted to be free of his father, he was going to have to face what that freedom actually meant. The decision came to me on a Tuesday morning while I was shaving, looking at my reflection and seeing not just an aging man, but a father who still had something to say. I would call Daniel one more time, but this wouldn't be about me anymore. This would be about giving him a final chance to remember who we used to be to each other. I waited until evening, until I could be reasonably sure he'd be home from work, settled into whatever routine he and Sarah had built together. My hands shook slightly as I dialed his number, but my voice was steady when he answered on the 3rd ring. "Dad?" He sounded surprised, maybe even a little worried. When had my calls become so rare that they caused concern instead of welcome? "Hello, Daniel." I kept my tone even, neither pleading nor angry. "I won't keep you long. I just need to say something." There was a pause, and I could hear the television in the background, the sounds of a normal evening in a normal life. "Okay," he said finally. "I don't want to fight with you," I began, each word carefully chosen. "I don't want to make your wedding day difficult or uncomfortable. I just want to be there to see you happy." Silence stretched between us, filled with all the words we weren't saying, all the history we were trying to navigate. "I know I haven't been a perfect father," I continued. "I know I've made mistakes, probably more than I realize. But Daniel, I love you. That's never changed, not once in 27 years. More silence. Then, in a voice that sounded dead older than his 27 years, colder than I'd ever heard it. "Dad, please don't come to the wedding. It's better this way." Better. That word again, like a knife twisted in the same wound. "Better for who?" I asked, and for the first time there was an edge to my voice. "For everyone," he said quietly. "For me, for Sarah, for the whole situation. It's complicated." Complicated. As if love was supposed to be simple, as if families came with instruction manuals, as if the bond between a father and son could be reduced to logistical problems. "What did I do?" I asked, and I wasn't ashamed of the pain in my voice. Help me understand what I did that was so terrible that you can't bear to have me at your wedding." The pause was so long I thought he might have hung up. Then, "It's not one thing, Dad. It's just, we're different people now. We want different things. It's better if we keep some distance. Distance. Space. Better." All these words that meant the same thing. Without you. "I won't cause a scene," I said. "I won't embarrass you. I'll sit in the back. I'll keep quiet. I'll leave right after the ceremony if that's what you want. I just need to see my son get married." "Dad, please." His voice cracked slightly, and for a moment I heard an echo of the boy he used to be. "Please don't make this harder than it already is." "Harder for who?" I asked again. "Because it's pretty hard for me too, Daniel. It's hard to learn that the son you raised, the boy you loved more than your own life, thinks you're such a liability that he can't even invite you to his wedding. It's not like that." "Then what is it like? Explain it to me, because I've been trying to understand for weeks and I can't figure out what I did to deserve this." Another long pause. I could hear him breathing, could imagine him struggling with words he didn't want to say or couldn't find. Finally, "Dad, I have to go. Sarah's calling me." Sarah. Of course it came back to Sarah, the woman who would become my daughter-in-law without me there to welcome her into our family. The woman who had somehow convinced my son that his father was expendable. "Daniel, wait!" But the line was already dead. I sat there holding the phone until the silence became unbearable, then set it down with more care than I felt. The conversation had accomplished nothing except to confirm what I already knew. My son had made his decision, and no amount of love or logic or pleading was going to change his mind. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, writing the letter that would have to say everything I couldn't say in person. If Daniel wouldn't let me attend his wedding, then I would find another way to be present, another way to make sure he heard what needed to be heard. The first draft was angry, full of accusations and hurt feelings. I wrote about sacrifice and ingratitude, about sleepless nights and thankless years, about the ways a father's love could be rewarded with rejection. I wrote until my hand cramped and my anger was spent, then crumpled up those pages and threw them away. The second draft was pleading, desperate, full of apologies for crimes I couldn't name, and promises to be different in ways I didn't understand. I begged him to reconsider, offered to change, swore I would be whatever kind of father he needed if he would just let me back into his life. But reading those words made me feel pathetic, so those pages joined the first draft in the garbage. The third draft was the one I kept. It was honest without being cruel, sad without being manipulative, final without being bitter. I wrote about love that doesn't disappear just because it's not wanted anymore. I wrote about the man I'd tried to be and the father I thought I'd been. I wrote about memories that couldn't be rewritten and a bond that couldn't be severed, even by silence. "A father is not perfect," I wrote near the end, "but he is still a father. To be unwanted at your child's wedding is to die while still living." The words felt true, felt important, felt like something that needed to be said even if, especially if, they would be difficult to hear. I sealed the letter in an envelope and wrote Daniel's name across the front in my careful handwriting. Then I called my lawyer, Jim Patterson, a family friend who had known Daniel since he was a boy, who had watched him grow up and would understand why this mattered. "Jim," I said when he answered, "I need a favor." Jim listened without interrupting as I explained the situation, as I told him about the wedding invitation that never came, and the son who no longer wanted his father in his life. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Jesus, Tom," he said finally. "I'm sorry. I had no idea." "Will you do it?" I asked. "Will you deliver the letter on the wedding day?" Another pause. "Are you sure about this? Once those words are out there, you can't take them back." "I'm sure," I said. And I was. If Daniel wants to erase me from his life, that's his choice. But he's going to have to do it in front of everyone who matters to him. He's going to have to own that decision publicly. "All right," Jim said quietly. "If that's what you want, I'll do it." After I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. Not happiness, not hope, but the simple relief of having taken action instead of just enduring pain. The letter would speak for me when I couldn't speak for myself. It would be my presence at Daniel's wedding, my final gift to the son who no longer wanted gifts from his father. I wasn't trying to hurt him or embarrass him or ruin his special day. I was trying to remind him that fathers don't just disappear because they're inconvenient, that love doesn't evaporate because it's not returned, that some bonds run too deep to be severed by silence and rejection. Whether he understood that or not was up to him. Whether he forgave me for refusing to disappear quietly was up to him, too. But at least he would hear my voice one more time, even if it was only on paper, even if it was the last time he ever wanted to listen. At least I wouldn't go down without saying what needed to be said. The days leading up to Daniel's wedding moved with the strange rhythm of time before an execution. I knew the date, June 15th, a Saturday afternoon, and I found myself counting down like I was waiting for my own judgment day. In a way, I suppose I was. I'd given Jim Patterson my letter 3 weeks before the ceremony, along with explicit instructions about when and how to deliver it. Wait until after the processional, I'd told him. After Sarah walks down the aisle and they've exchanged vows, but before they're pronounced husband and wife. That moment when everyone's feeling emotional and grateful and thinking about family. Jim had looked uncomfortable with the whole arrangement, but he'd agreed. "You're sure about the timing?" he'd asked. "You want to do this in front of everyone?" "That's exactly when I want to do it," I'd said. "If Daniel is going to reject his father, he should do it publicly. Let everyone see what kind of man he's become." The letter had been rewritten so many times I could recite it from memory. I'd crafted each sentence carefully, balancing honesty with dignity, pain with restraint. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't gentle either. It was simply true, a father's final words to a son who had chosen to forget him. I spent those waiting weeks in a strange state of suspension, neither fully sad nor fully angry, just existing in the space between hope and despair. I cleaned my house obsessively, as if Daniel might suddenly change his mind and come visit. I bought new clothes I had no occasion to wear, as if looking respectable might somehow matter to someone who no longer cared about my appearance. The morning of the wedding, I woke before dawn and couldn't get back to sleep. I made coffee and sat in my kitchen, staring out at the backyard where Daniel had once played as a boy. The treehouse was still there in the old oak, weathered now but sturdy. A monument to Saturday afternoons, when we'd built something together with our hands and our hope for the future. I wondered what he was doing at that moment. Was he nervous? Excited? Was he thinking about his father at all? Or had he successfully compartmentalized me out of this most important day? Around noon, I drove to a park near the wedding venue, not close enough to cause problems, but near enough that I could imagine the sounds of celebration floating on the wind. I sat on a bench and watched other families enjoying their Saturday afternoon. Children playing on swings while their parents watched. Teenagers throwing frisbees while their grandparents cheered them on. Normal families doing normal things, taking for granted the bonds that held them together. At 2:30, I knew the ceremony was beginning. I closed my eyes and tried to picture it. Daniel in his tuxedo, handsome and nervous and happy. Sarah in white, beautiful and radiant, and finally getting the wedding of her dreams. The church filled with friends and family, everyone who mattered to them gathered to witness their vows. Everyone except the man who had raised the groom. At 3 o'clock, I knew Jim was standing up in that church with my letter in his hand. I'd told him to read it slowly, clearly, making sure every word could be heard. I'd told him not to apologize for the content or try to soften its impact. These were my words, my truth, my final statement as Daniel's father. I couldn't be there in person, but my voice would fill that church. My love and my pain and my disappointment would be witnessed by everyone who claimed to care about my son. They would hear what it meant to exclude a father from his child's wedding. They would understand the cost of Daniel's decision. The letter began with memories, specific, undeniable moments when I had been the father Daniel needed. The night he'd had pneumonia at 6 years old, and I'd slept in a chair beside his hospital bed. The time he'd struck out to end his Little League season, and I'd held him while he cried, telling him that losing didn't make him a loser. The conversation we'd had about colleges, about dreams, about the man he wanted to become. I was there, the letter said. For every fever, every fear, every triumph and disappointment. I was there because that's what fathers do. We show up, we stay. We love without condition and without end. Then it moved to the present, to the phone call that had shattered everything I thought I knew about our relationship. I'd written about the confusion, the desperate search for understanding, the growing realization that my son had decided I was no longer welcome in his life. "You have the right to choose your guests," the letter continued, "but you don't have the right to rewrite history. You don't have the right to pretend that 27 years of love and sacrifice and presence didn't happen. You don't have the right to erase your father because he's inconvenient." The middle section was the hardest to write, and would be the hardest to hear. I'd listed the ways I thought I'd failed him, the moments when I'd been too strict, or too distant, or too demanding. I'd acknowledged that I wasn't perfect, that I'd made mistakes, that perhaps my love had sometimes felt like pressure. "But even imperfect love is still love," I'd written. "Even flawed fathers are still fathers, and sons who reject their fathers without explanation, who cast them aside like broken furniture, need to look in the mirror and ask themselves what kind of men they've become." The letter's climax came near the end, the paragraph I'd labored over most. "A father is not perfect, but he is still a father. To be unwanted at your child's wedding is to die while still living. You are killing me slowly, Daniel, with your silence and your distance and your cold, careful politeness. If that is what you want, then you're succeeding. But everyone in this room should know what it costs to exclude love from your life. Everyone should understand what you're choosing when you choose to forget the man who gave you everything he had." The letter ended simply. "I love you, I will always love you, but I will not disappear quietly just because my love has become inconvenient. These words are my presents at your wedding, my final gift to the son who no longer wants gifts from his father." Sitting on that park bench, I imagined Jim's voice reading those words to a room full of people who had gathered to celebrate love. I imagined the silence that would follow, the uncomfortable shifting in seats, the way people would look at Daniel and wonder what kind of man excludes his own father from his wedding. I imagined Daniel's face as the words hit him, as the carefully constructed narrative of his perfect day crumbled under the weight of truth. Would he be angry, embarrassed? Would he finally feel some fraction of the pain he'd caused me? Or would he simply see this as confirmation that he'd been right to exclude me, that his father was exactly the kind of man who would disrupt a wedding with his own hurt feelings? Either way, it was done. The letter would be read, the truth would be spoken, and Daniel would have to live with the knowledge that his actions had consequences, that fathers don't just disappear without leaving wounds that never quite heal. By 4 o'clock, I knew it was over. The letter had been read, the ceremony had concluded, the reception was probably beginning. My son was married now, officially and permanently joined to a woman who had never wanted me in their lives. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through neighborhoods where other families were having normal Saturday afternoons. The house felt different when I walked through the door, not empty exactly, but finished. Like a story that had reached its conclusion, even if it wasn't the ending anyone had hoped for. That evening, I poured myself a whiskey and sat in my recliner, thinking about the letter that was now part of Daniel's wedding story forever. Some guests would forget it eventually, would focus on the happy moments and let the uncomfortable truth fade into background noise. But Daniel would remember, Sarah would remember, and maybe, years from now, when they told their children about their wedding day, they would have to explain why Grandpa wasn't in any of the pictures. Maybe they would even tell the truth about what that absence cost, about the father who loved them enough to refuse to disappear quietly. Or maybe they would just pretend that some people are born without fathers, that some stories don't have painful chapters, that love always knows when to be quiet and convenient and invisible. But the letter existed now. My words were part of their wedding forever, and that would have to be enough. The phone didn't ring that evening, or the next day, or the day after that. The silence stretched like a held breath, and I found myself caught between hoping for Daniel's call and dreading what he might say if it came. Jim Patterson called me on Monday morning, his voice careful and professional. "It's done, Tom. I read the letter just like you asked." "How did it go?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "It was powerful. There wasn't a dry eye in the church by the time I finished reading it. The silence afterward, it was something else. You could have heard a pin drop." I closed my eyes and tried to picture it, a room full of wedding guests sitting in stunned silence, processing words they hadn't expected to hear on what was supposed to be a day of pure celebration. "What did Daniel do?" I asked. Jim was quiet for a moment. He didn't look up, just stared at his shoes the whole time I was reading. Sarah was crying, not happy tears, but the kind that come from shock. Some of the guests were looking around at each other, trying to figure out how to respond. And after? After I finished, I set the letter on the altar and walked out. That's what you asked me to do. I didn't stick around for reactions. The altar. My words sitting on the altar like an offering, or maybe an accusation. The letter would have looked small in that sacred space, just a few pieces of paper that somehow contained 27 years of fatherhood reduced to its essential truth. Jim, I said, thank you. I know that wasn't easy. Tom, I hope you know what you've done. That letter, those people won't forget it. Neither will Daniel. After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring. Part of me expected Daniel to call immediately, full of anger and hurt and accusations. Part of me hoped he might call with understanding, maybe even apology. But the phone remained silent, and as the hours passed, I began to understand that this silence was Daniel's response. Tuesday came and went, Wednesday, Thursday. By Friday I realized that my son had heard my words, had felt their impact, and had chosen once again to say nothing. The letter that was supposed to force a conversation had instead deepened the chasm between us. But something unexpected began to happen. My phone did start ringing, just not with Daniel's voice. The first call came from my cousin Margaret, who lived in another state but had somehow heard about the wedding letter through the family network that carries news faster than the internet. Tom, she said, without preamble, I heard about what happened at Daniel's wedding. I wanted you to know that I think you did the right thing. I was so surprised I almost dropped the phone. You do? Damn right I do. That boy had no business cutting you out of his wedding like that. We all raised our children to be better than that. If he's embarrassed by his own father, then maybe he needed to be embarrassed in public. Margaret's call was followed by another from my old friend Pete, who'd been Daniel's baseball coach years ago. Tom, I don't know what got into that boy, but excluding you from his wedding was wrong. Plain wrong. I'm glad you didn't let him get away with it quietly. Then came Linda, my ex-wife, and her voice was tight with something I couldn't identify. Anger, maybe, or embarrassment. Tom, what you did at that wedding, that was cruel. Was it crueler than being excluded from my own son's wedding? I asked. You humiliated him in front of everyone he cares about. You made his wedding day about your hurt feelings instead of his happiness. His happiness was built on my erasure, Linda. Was I supposed to just accept that quietly? The conversation went downhill from there, ending with Linda's accusation that I was selfish and vindictive, that I'd proven Daniel right to exclude me. But even her anger felt like validation. If Linda was upset, it meant the letter had accomplished something, had forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth they'd rather ignore. Over the following weeks, I heard from relatives and family friends I hadn't spoken to in years. The letter had become legendary in its own way, the story spreading through our extended family like ripples in a pond. Some people supported what I'd done, seeing it as a father's righteous stand against ungrateful children. Others condemned it as unselfish disruption of a sacred ceremony. But everyone had an opinion, and everyone was talking about it. The wedding that was supposed to erase me from Daniel's story had instead made me its most memorable character. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, whose own son lived across the country and rarely called, stopped by with a casserole and an unexpected confession. Mr. Thompson, she said, I heard about your son's wedding. My friend's daughter was there. She said your letter was beautiful and heartbreaking. I wanted you to know that some of us understand what you did. She paused, looking down at her hands. My son never calls, never visits. I send him money for his birthday and get a text message thank you. If he gets married someday and doesn't invite me, I hope I have your courage to speak up. These conversations were both comforting and troubling. I hadn't written the letter to gain supporters or start a movement. I'd written it for Daniel, to force him to confront what his rejection meant. But in trying to reach my son, I'd apparently spoken for other parents who felt forgotten by their adult children, other fathers who'd been pushed aside in favor of new families and different values. The letter had become bigger than just my relationship with Daniel. It had become a symbol of something many parents were feeling but were afraid to say out loud, that their children's independence sometimes felt like abandonment, that being asked to step back sometimes meant being asked to disappear. But the person I most wanted to hear from remained silent. Daniel never called, never wrote, never acknowledged that the letter existed. It was as if he'd decided that the best response to my public declaration of love and hurt was to pretend it had never happened. 3 weeks after the wedding, I ran into Sarah's mother at the grocery store. I recognized her from the engagement party I'd been invited to, back when I was still considered part of Daniel's family. She saw me coming down the cereal aisle and looked like she wanted to escape, but I was blocking her path. "Mrs. Morrison," I said quietly. "Mr. Thompson." Her voice was cool, careful. We stood there for an awkward moment, two people who should have been in-laws but were instead strangers, connected only by the complicated pain of family rejection. "How are they doing?" I asked finally. "Daniel and Sarah?" She studied me for a long moment, as if trying to decide how much truth I could handle. "They're adjusting. The wedding was beautiful, despite everything. Despite everything. Despite the letter that had reminded everyone that weddings are supposed to celebrate the joining of families, not the severing of them. "I want you to know," I said, "I wasn't trying to hurt them, I was just trying to be heard." Mrs. Morrison's expression softened slightly. "I know," she said quietly, "and I think some people needed to hear what you had to say, even if it was difficult." She paused, glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Sarah cried for days after the wedding, not because she was upset with you, but because she finally understood what excluding you had cost. She said she never realized. She never thought about what it would feel like from your perspective." It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for months. "Will you tell her," I said, "that I don't hate her, that I never wanted to hurt her on her wedding day? I needed my son to understand that fathers don't disappear just because they're not wanted anymore." Mrs. Morrison nodded. "I'll tell her." As she walked away, I realized that the letter had accomplished something I hadn't expected. It hadn't brought Daniel back to me, but it had made people think about what it means to exclude family, what it costs to choose convenience over connection. The silence from Daniel continued, but it was no longer the silence of invisibility. It was calm. The silence of someone who had heard difficult truths and was struggling to figure out how to respond. It was the silence of a son who could no longer pretend his father didn't exist, even if he still didn't want him in his life. And somehow, that felt like progress. 6 months have passed since Daniel's wedding, and the silence between us has settled into something that feels permanent, like scar tissue over a wound that will never fully heal. But the strange thing about scars is that they're often stronger than the original skin, and I've found a strength in this silence that I didn't expect. The letter changed things, not just between Daniel and me, but in ways I'm still discovering. People see me differently now, not as the absent father Daniel had painted me to be, but as a man who refused to disappear quietly when he was pushed aside. Some admire that courage, others find it uncomfortable, but nobody forgets it. I've learned to live with both the love and the loss, to carry them like stones in my pocket that remind me of their weight without crushing me. I still love my son. That hasn't changed and never will. But I no longer love him desperately, no longer love him with the kind of hope that kept me awake at night wondering what I'd done wrong. I love him now the way you love someone who has moved beyond your reach, the way you love a memory that can't be changed or improved, only remembered with whatever mixture of joy and sadness it deserves. The house feels different these days. Not empty, I've made peace with the quiet, but purposeful in a way it wasn't before. I've started volunteering at the community center, helping other men my age who are struggling with their own family distances. We don't talk much about our specific situations, but we understand each other in the way that people who've survived similar losses understand each other. There's Jerry, whose daughter moved to California and calls twice a year if he's lucky. There's Rank, whose son got divorced and now uses the grandchildren as weapons in a war Frank never wanted to fight. There's Mike, whose boy got involved with drugs and blames his father for everything that went wrong in his life. We meet Tuesday evenings and play cards, but mostly we just sit in each other's company, a group of fathers who've learned that love doesn't always get the ending it deserves. We've all made mistakes, all said the wrong things at the wrong times, all struggled with the impossible balance between holding on and letting go. But we're still fathers. That doesn't change just because our children have decided they don't need us anymore. Last month, I got a letter from a woman in Oregon whose story was remarkably similar to mine. Her daughter had excluded her from her wedding because the new husband's family found her too dramatic. She'd read about my letter online. Apparently, someone had posted the story on social media and it had been shared thousands of times. "Your courage gave me courage," she wrote. "I spoke up at my daughter's baby shower. I didn't cause a scene, but I made sure everyone understood what it felt like to be pushed out of my own grandchild's life. It was hard, but it was necessary. Thank you for showing me that dignity matters more than keeping the peace." I've gotten dozens of letters like that, from parents who felt invisible until they read about someone else who refused to disappear quietly. I never meant to become a symbol of anything, but apparently that's what happens when you insist on being heard in a world that often prefers its elderly parents to be conveniently silent. Daniel still lives 25 minutes away, but it might as well be on another planet. I see his car sometimes when I'm driving through his neighborhood, and I wonder if he ever thinks about me when he passes the places where we used to go together. The Bay, the ball field where I coached his team, the ice cream shop where we celebrated every small victory, the park where I taught him to ride a bike and promised him I'd always be there to catch him if he fell. I kept that promise for 27 years. He was the one who decided he didn't need catching anymore. I heard through Linda that they bought a house in a different neighborhood, farther from me, in a development where the houses are bigger and the lawns are more perfect, and the distance from his old life is measured in more than just miles. Sarah is pregnant, apparently. My first grandchild, growing in the belly of a woman who will probably never tell the baby about the grandfather who exists but isn't welcome. The news should have broken my heart, but instead, it made me feel something like peace. I'll be a grandfather whether Daniel acknowledges me or not. That child will carry my genes, my blood, pieces of the man I was, and the father I tried to be. Someday, maybe, that child will ask questions about family history and wonder why there are no pictures of Daddy's father in the house. Maybe Daniel will tell the truth about what happened. Maybe he'll explain that some fathers love too hard or expect too much or fail to evolve in the ways their children need them to. Maybe he'll even acknowledge that the letter wasn't cruel, just honest, and that sometimes honesty is the only gift we have left to give. Or maybe he'll create a story that makes him the hero and me the villain, a narrative where his choices were justified and his father's pain was irrelevant. People believe the stories that make their own actions seem reasonable, and children are especially good at rewriting history to make their parents the source of all their problems. Either way, I've done what I needed to do. I've spoken my truth, claimed my place in Daniel's story, refused to be edited out of a life I helped create. The letter will always exist. My words will always be part of his wedding story, and everyone who was there will remember that somewhere there was a father who loved his son enough to risk embarrassment and rejection to make sure that love was acknowledged. I walk differently now, stand straighter, speak with more authority when people ask about my family. I have a son, I tell them, but we're not in touch. Simple, factual, without shame or apology. Some relationships don't survive the transition from child to adult, and that's a tragedy, but it's not always a failure. Sometimes it's just the cost of raising a child to be independent, to value their own choices above their parents' feelings, to build lives that reflect their own values rather than their upbringing. I wanted Daniel to be strong and self-sufficient and confident enough to make his own decisions. I succeeded. He chose to make a decision that broke my heart, but he made it with strength and certainty and complete independence from my influence. In some twisted way, that's exactly the kind of man I tried to raise. The treehouse is still in my backyard, weathered now and probably unsafe, but I haven't had the heart to tear it down. Sometimes I sit beneath it with my morning coffee and remember the Saturday afternoons we spent up there, planning adventures and sharing secrets and believing that we were building something that would last forever. We were building something that lasted, not the relationship I'd hoped for, but the foundation of the man Daniel became, the values I taught him, the strength I tried to give him, the confidence I helped him develop. All of that is still there, even if he uses it now to keep me at a distance. I am still his father. He is still my son. Those facts exist independent of his feelings about them, independent of his choices, independent of his silence. A letter read at a wedding 6 months ago didn't change our biology or our story or the 27 years when we loved each other without complication. It just made sure that everyone knows those years happened, that they mattered, that the father who lived them refuses to pretend they didn't exist just because they ended badly. In the quiet of my house, in the peace I've found in acceptance, I've learned that dignity is more important than reconciliation, that speaking truth is more valuable than keeping peace, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to disappear when someone wants you gone. I will always be Daniel's father. I will always love the boy he was and hope for the man he's becoming. But I will not apologize for claiming that space in his story, for insisting that fathers matter even when children decide they don't want them around. The letter spoke when I couldn't. My dignity remains intact. And in the strange mathematics of family love, that has to be enough. That is what remains of a father, not the relationship he wanted, but the truth he was brave enough to speak, the love he was strong enough to claim, and the dignity he was wise enough to preserve. Sometimes that's the only victory left to win. If this story touched something in your heart, if you've ever felt forgotten by someone you raised and loved, please share it. Sometimes our pain finds its purpose in helping others feel less alone. Sometimes speaking our truth is the only way to honor the love that shaped us, even when that love is no longer wanted. Remember, you don't disappear just because someone looks away. You matter because you loved, because you showed up, because you were there when it counted. That can never be taken from you, no matter how much silence tries to erase it.